thank you all for being here, because one of the nightmares I have before moderating a panel like this is always that no one will show up, and it'll just be the panelists on stage talking to one another. So thank you for coming here this evening to hear this fantastic topic with this fantastic panel. I'm Susan Page. I'm the Washington Bureau Chief of USA Today, and I'm delighted to be here, and I'm grateful to Aspen and to Audi for sponsoring this panel. I do want to just mention before we get started that we have in our thoughts our journalistic colleagues at the Capital Gazette News in Annapolis, Maryland, where 5 journalists were shot and killed today, and others are wounded and fighting for their lives. And yet they are going ahead and publishing tomorrow's edition in any case, and our thoughts definitely with them. The thing that makes this such an incredibly fantastic panel is that we have groundbreaking stars of journalism here, and we also have rising stars. And I think their perspective on what we see happening with women in the news media is going to be illuminating and interesting to hear. And I'm just going to introduce them briefly, and I have to start with Katie Couric, of course. Katie is an award-winning journalist, co-founder of Stand Up to Cancer, a best-selling author, a familiar face in every household in America, a groundbreaker. She was the co-anchor of the Today Show. At CBS, she became the first woman ever to be the solo lead anchor on an evening newscast, a great achievement. Thanks for all you've done.
Thanks.
And I should just mention that she has many projects in the works. One of them is America Inside Out with Katie Couric, which is a 6-part series on National Geographic that's dealing with gender inequality. So we look forward to that.
Yeah, one of them is all sorts of big social issues.
All big social issues.
Available on Hulu and YouTube and Nat Geo on demand. Thank you.
And next to her is Adrienne Green, managing editor of The Atlantic magazine, which is a big job she got last October. Congratulations. And she comes with an entourage, clearly. She had previously been the editor-in-chief of Fangle magazine, which has not been around as long as The Atlantic, which was founded in 1857, by the way.
160 years.
Thanks for joining us. Next to her is Shannon Van Sant, who is a documentary filmmaker and co-founder of Press Forward, which aims to change newsroom culture. We're going to have her talk about that in just a few minutes. She works for NPR. She is just back for the past 7 months from spending a decade in China and Hong Kong. She's directed 18 documentaries all across Asia and China, South Korea, and in sub-Saharan Africa, working for PBS Television and CBS News. Thanks for being with us. Next to her is Mona Charen, who's a syndicated columnist, a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, a best-selling author, and her new book, which I'm sure will be a best-selling book, came out Tuesday, which was just 2 days ago. It's titled Sex Matters: How Modern Feminism Lost Touch with Science, Love, and Common Sense. I first met Mona when she was working in the Reagan White House and the Jack Kemp presidential campaign, so we go back a long way. Mona, thanks for being with us. And last but not least, Rebecca Blumenstein. She's the deputy managing editor of the New York Times, a job she's held for about 1.5 years. She was previously the deputy editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal, where, among others, my son worked for her. He's a wonderful boy, isn't he? It's true. She was managing editor of WSJ.com and China bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal, where she oversaw a team that won the Pulitzer Prize for international reporting. Thanks for being here. So, I think that a lot of us had our jaws dropping when we heard about these allegations and assertions quite credibly made about the behavior of what was happening in some media newsrooms. And Katie, I wanted to ask you something that really sparked and fueled the METOO movement. Was this surprising to you, or was it just something that a lot of people didn't know about and it was just the way things worked?
I mean, I think it depends on a case-by-case basis. Certainly, when it came to Matt, this was a real surprise to so many of his colleagues. just because we just weren't aware of it. I think it wasn't something that was overt. I still don't really have a full understanding of the women who he was involved with and the circumstances, but clearly it was an inappropriate abuse of his position and his power, and it was really disheartening and heartbreaking for a lot of people who saw him as a very different person. I think there was sort of this feeling, I think it's, I'm 61, so I've been doing this a long time, and women of my generation, that there was a certain amount of behavior that went on. I would hear, I'm talking not about Matt, but other people, you'd hear rumors, you'd hear speculation, newsrooms are notoriously gossipy. And, I would just sort of say, oh, really gross, or I don't know, and I was too busy working and being a single mom of 2 little girls and really focused on my career to pay much attention to it. But I think there were certain mores, that were just kind of accepted in television news for a very long time. And I think one of the great things about this is it's a huge cultural course correction. And we are now really examining newsroom cultures. And that's a very hard thing to kind of put your finger on. But I think there are a myriad of ways that things are going to get better, but first the awareness was necessary. And I really credit a younger generation of women. I think there's a real generational shift. I notice in my daughters, who are 26 and 22, who have a lot more agency, who are much more informed about sexual assault and affirmative consent and all these things that I think they have a very different view of their place in the world and how to interact with men in a work environment, which I think is a really good thing. I'm lucky. I've only experienced a few incidents when I was much younger where, the vice president of CNN said I was successful because of my hard work and my industriousness, my intelligence, and my breast size. And he said it in a room in front of a whole group of executives. When I walked into a room, I was 26 years old. And I remember I wrote him a scathing memo saying, hey, first of all, my boss, a male named Don Farmer, who I really credit for making me strong, and I'll stop talking and I'll tell this story quickly, you guys, sorry. But he said, you know what? We're going to sit down, you're going to write him a memo, and you're going to tell him that's completely unacceptable and he owes you an apology. Now, this was in 1984, right? And so I wrote this letter. He called me immediately. He was just effusive in his apology. But it kind of made me realize, you know what? I don't have to put up with that bullshit. And I had a male ally who helped give me the strength to fight back. And that set the tone for me for my entire career, that I was actually not going to put up with that.
Yeah. I think a lot of women didn't feel empowered to fight back. I mean, and I think a couple things have changed. And one is willingness of women to speak up. And the other is willingness of others to believe women when they speak up. Because that's also been something. Is this only in TV networks, Rebecca, or in the print world has there been this kind of routine sexual harassment?
I mean, I think the amazing thing is we don't really know. The Times was obviously at the center of a lot of the journalism over the past year, and getting women, when the system didn't work again and again and again, to go on the record and to tell their stories was our biggest challenge. And there are these settlements that remain secret for so long, that continue to remain secret among, I think, much of corporate America, much of Wall Street. The women who, Ashley Judd, the women who went on the record against Harvey Weinstein, who was one of the most powerful men, in the world, quite frankly, it was incredibly courageous of them. And not every story is of that is of that level, is of that interest. But there have been a lot of stories that have come out since. And I feel like we have a lot of conversation in terms of moving this discussion forward, how it should work. We want to be fair to everybody, but it's just been like an eruption that I think has, that's not at all over. And you think about corporate America, what just happened at Intel last week. We haven't heard much from Wall Street. There are academia. This is I think, pulsing throughout America. And I think the very positive thing, though, is that, to your point, Katie, younger women and women for the first time have really received the message. The METOO hashtag gave them the courage to speak and to come forward. And this just did not happen until last year, and it's a sea change.
You know, the New York Times story about Harvey Weinstein played a big part in making this explode. How did that work? Was that a conscious and a hard story to do, right? A dangerous story to do in some ways. Was that a conscious decision by the Times that you were going to invest whatever it took to break that story, and then you were going to put it on page one?
Well, I think people kind of forget that what came first was a Bill O'Reilly story.
Yes.
And that was, in some ways, an even harder story, because those were women who had been at the network, who had signed these secret settlements, and our reporters, Emily Steele and Mike Schmidt, had to convince women to go on the record to actually, you know, we'd heard about these settlements, but to actually state what they were and corroborate was so difficult. And then this amazing thing happened with O'Reilly, where we thought, you know, we would print this story, and usually nothing happens. But what happened is that Mercedes-Benz and advertisers peeled away from him. And so I think that this is as much an external societal moment as anything else, because the Bill O'Reilly would still be there had all the advertisers not peeled away. At that moment, we said, well, how big is this? And so we had some meetings and said, let's look into where this exists elsewhere. And Harvey was at the top of the list, but we also, I think it's very important, one of the most searing stories that the Times did last year was about women who work on the Ford assembly line. Yeah. And we cannot forget that women, who work in blue-collar jobs, who clean hotel rooms, that they have like far fewer protections than many of us who work in media organizations. And we felt that was really, so we did do a concerted push. And Harvey was a big fish that many news organizations had tried to go after. And it was just so hard because no one was willing to go on the record until we finally were able to pierce that.
It's interesting that corporations which are profit-making enterprises, decided it was in their interest to do a socially conscious thing in this case. I think maybe reflects social media shaming them when they didn't.
There's a lot of discussion, including here today, about what's happening at companies. And I think, if you're a consumer-facing company with customers, with employees, with people who need to feel they're part of a mission, with millennials and the Generation Z, it's not acceptable maybe it has to do with the political environment and people thinking that business needs to play a more active role in terms of leadership. But it's really interesting what's going on.
It has been. Shannon, we've talked a lot about what's happened to the men who've been accused of abusing women in the workplace, and the big names, the Charlie Rose and the Matt Lauers and the Mark Halperins. We should talk more about what it's meant to young women who were in those workplaces and what it meant to them, their careers. You did a really interesting piece in Politico about your own experience. Tell us something about that.
Yeah. So I was an assistant to a man named Mark Halperin. He was a political director at ABC News, and I was about 19 at the time. I met him in college, and I never experienced untoward behavior from him myself, but I did notice things that were off. He had several young women about my age that he would mentor and meet with. The door would be closed. And he was very gracious. I mean, we worked together very well. He got me my first job in journalism at ABC News afterwards. And I have to say, though, after I began working at ABC full-time, I felt uncomfortable around him. Not for anything I could put my finger on. I felt nervous in his presence. He didn't seem like a nice person, so I just avoided meeting with him, and I avoided his presence. And it was several years later, actually, when I was reporting in Beijing, that I heard from a couple of women who were based in China for a while, foreign correspondents and producers, or who had traveled through on reporting assignments, that they'd been assaulted by him. That in one of those closed-door meetings, he had assaulted them in pretty egregious ways. And what was surprising to me, though, and is that I didn't really even have much of a reaction. My reaction was not one of outrage. I did not think, oh, this should not have happened, or we should do something to change this. My reaction when I was told these stories was I was lucky, and I managed that situation well. And it wasn't until this movement in last fall, when actually a young researcher or editor for the New York Times, I had told her about Mark Halperin about a year and a half ago, and about the stories I'd heard about him, and she said, this is a story. Can I share it with one of our reporters? And I said, sure, you're welcome to do so, but I don't think it's a story. This happens all the time, and this is just the way it is. And I'm 40, I think she's a bit younger. And then when the news broke about Harvey Weinstein and all of these men, to me, I mean, it just hit me like a wave, like, oh my God, I can't believe that this behavior, which is so appalling, it was just a part of my normal day. And I think going overseas and having that foreign correspondence work, I mean, this dynamic has chased me. I've had it in multiple experiences with multiple men. And it's deeply impacts the women. And I would say that the victims of some of the stars that we're talking about tonight, their lives have been profoundly impacted. I mean, this isn't about saying you have a nice skirt on or some sort of innocuous comment. I mean, the behavior that we're talking about, it causes women to quit their jobs, to leave the industry, to have a sense of fear about a place of work where they should be safe and they should be thriving. So it's a really profound issue, and part of the profundity of it is the fact that people like me, who were in the midst of it, thought it was normal. So,
Adrienne, I think your perspective may be different because you are 25 years old, and yeah, I know.
All the whispers,
right?
oh my goodness.
I remember 25.
Yeah.
And I wonder if this just seems incredibly archaic to you, that this is just, that the point of view of millennials is just different from what you've heard from women on the stage. Is it different? What is the perspective of millennials now when it comes to this particular issue?
Well, I will speak for myself, a millennial, in saying I don't think it actually is that different. I think that we are in a time when women are likelier to be believed, and that people think that when they speak, people are likelier to speak up, and then when they do, it is more often that they are believed. I think that to complicate that a little bit, race and gender and class and sexual orientation and all of the kind of intersectional identities affect that, right? I think that not everyone is equally believed in the same way. And I think that we have a tendency, it is a critique of feminism at large, and I think METOO, it undergirds that we often pin these narratives to women who are white and women who we can pin a level of sexual virtue onto, and people who don't embody that or aren't assumed to embody that same level of virtue are not believed in the same way. And I think, I am a millennial, but I'm also a Black woman, and I am also cognizant of how that affects the way that people are listened to, and whose stories get told, and whose stories get prioritized, and who gets assistance, and how we conceive of diversity in the workplace and programs that are meant to raise women up, and that necessarily can't be divorced from how we look at how to support other identities. I'm so glad that you brought up women who work in blue-collar jobs and women who are migrant workers and domestic workers and work in service industries. Their ability to believe in what the cost for those things are is slightly different than those of us who might work in a newsroom.
Do you think that women... Do you think that women of color are still not believed?
I think that's complicated, right? I think that women of color are not a monolith. I think it depends a lot on the intersection of race and class and position and where you stand in the hierarchy and your level of adjacency to power. I think women of color, in broad strokes, if we're talking in the abstract, have a tendency to not have that level of virtue ascribed to them, to be looked at as hypersexualized, and having that affect their ability to be believed.
Can I just raise one
Yes,
issue
of
related
course.
to the story we did on Ford? I think that it was a very powerful story, but I also have to, and life-changing, to your point, for the women involved. But it was Harvey Weinstein and the celebrities, and something about the Hollywood nature of this that captivated people. We wanted the traffic to the Ford story to be as high as the Harvey Weinstein story, but it wasn't, because people somehow, that hit them in a way that and the celebrities who ended up, including Matt, involved in this, that was much more, it's sad in some ways, I think, but that was what moved this needle in such a profound way.
But they're also known individuals,
Yeah.
you know, that people are familiar with. And
That's
I think
true.
as harrowing and upsetting, and even in many ways, to everyone's point, more upsetting, domestic workers or, you know, maids in hotels, I read a statistic that 49% of them have a guest expose themselves to them. And I'm like, what is wrong with these people, by the way? That's a whole nother Oprah. We'll get to another panel. But, you know, I think that this familiarity is what brought it to everyone's attention, because it was famous people that they saw on their television screens or that they knew about. And, you know, I think as long as the wave continues to help other women, then that's okay.
So it's what people that they recognize, celebrities, but it's also things they saw in their own lives. And actually, when the Harvey Weinstein story broke in the Times, I was on Morning Joe with Mark Halperin, and who was, you know, not at that point under any kind of fire. And he said that this was really a Hollywood problem. And I thought I was on the air, where I'm not always, you know, I usually think of the great thing I should have said once we're off the air. And I was thinking, you know, I don't really think that's true. I don't think this is just a Hollywood problem. But as it turned out, it was not just a Hollywood problem. Well, I wonder if your perspective is different on any of this. If you think that the Me Too movement has gone too far, if there are ways in which you have concerns about what it's done, tell us what your perspective is.
Well, thank you. First, delighted to be here. It's my first time at the Aspen Ideas Festival, and I appreciate the invitation very much. Though I arrived today, my luggage didn't, so this is what I was traveling in. I did bring something really pretty to wear. You'll just have to take my word for it. But, so this is the second time that I have discussed this issue on a panel. The last time was at a panel at Harvard, and somebody asked me that question. They said, don't you think that the Me Too movement has gone too far?
I didn't say, don't you think, I said, do you think?
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, the question comes up, has the movement gone too far? And what I said to the questioner there was, look around. The men who have been accused in the Me Too movement have not denied it. Nobody has said, I was wrongly accused, or, you know, there have been a few who've been, you know, a little bit of complaints around the edges. Al Franken said that, you know, he was taken out of context. He was misunderstood a little bit when he was getting a little handsy with people. But basically, all of the people that have been the subject of these exposés have essentially admitted guilt. So it's hard to see that we're in the midst of this overreaction, or that this has somehow been overdone. What I would say, though, and it's really interesting to get the perspective of women of different ages, because I'm like Katie, I'm also 61. I was sexually harassed as a college student, but it was so polite compared to what women are experiencing now. The grossness of the behavior that young women are experiencing and are being told is normal and just part of what you have to expect in the workplace. From my perspective, I think things have gotten worse since I was young. I think that men are more entitled and have a less respect for women and are less inhibited. And I have some theories about why that might be so, but one of them has to do with the prevalence of pornography in our society. If you look at the data on how much people consume porn and how many men make it a daily diet, it does begin to shed light on their behavior in the rest of their lives.
Hey, what was the polite sexual harassment you had in college? I'm just curious.
I had a professor, a science professor. I thought he was terrific, and he invited me to work on a project with him where we would together write a book for children about science. And this was going to be my summer job, and I was excited, and it was wonderful. And at some point in the late spring, he kind of took me out for dinner and said that, he thought this was the beginning of a beautiful relationship. And that he wasn't married, and that he hoped I didn't have a boyfriend, and on and on. And that was basically the gist of it. And I said, well, I wasn't really interested in that kind of a relationship. And he said, oh, well, and basically the way it ended was he never touched me. He didn't expose himself. He simply made it clear that if that wasn't part of the deal, that I didn't have the job.
So no children's book resulted?
No children's book, no.
So we're gonna do questions in a couple minutes, so I know that there'll be smart questions, because you're just such an intelligent-looking crowd, really, from one side to another. But let's talk a little about what ought to happen now. Katie, what should happen now? What changes ought to be made to make sure that women and men thrive in the workplace, and people of color and people of different sexual orientations? What needs to change when it comes to the way the news media works?
Well, I think a lot needs to change. And to your earlier point about all the women who have left journalism because they've experienced this kind of behavior. Just a quick anecdote. I've been trying to understand, since I was in a pretty powerful position early on. At 32 or 31, I was a Pentagon correspondent, and then I was on the Today Show. So I was lucky, and I didn't have to strive, and I didn't have to...
You weren't lucky, you were good.
Well, yeah, you're right. I was good. And you're right. But I was lucky in that I was not put in a position where someone powerful over me was trying to negotiate with me for certain things in order for me to thrive in my business. But I talked to one young woman, and she told me a story, and it really crystallized the impact and how careers can be stymied or destroyed by this kind of behavior. The earthquake in Haiti happened, and she had an opportunity to go cover it, which for a journalist, that's a transformational experience, to cover a huge crisis like that and to get that kind of experience under your belt. So a network anchor who shall not be named was going to be going, and she was going to be producing for that network anchor. And basically, the supervisor said he has a very bad reputation for inappropriate behavior. So instead of saying something to the perpetrator of this kind of behavior, he dispatched a male producer instead of her. So to me, that was like, wow. That is an example of how this can have such a terrible impact, not to mention overt harassment and sexual misconduct, but sort of almost kind of this sort of behavior and the repercussions of that, because that person is protected and enabled. So clearly, I think, just quickly, and I think Press Forward has a lot of actually concrete steps, but I think organizations have to take a really hard look at their cultures. And I'm not a big fan of internal investigations personally, because I think it's very hard to conduct those fairly and really evaluate what's going on inside an organization. So I think these organizations should welcome outside people who have expertise in this area to take a close look at behavior. I think that diversity training can't be something you send your assistant to so you can check it off the list. It has to be taken seriously. Human resources, I think, should be empowered. I think there should be consideration of a separate entity to bring complaints to, because often human resources departments are protecting the perpetrators and the high-ranking executives and trying to prevent, liability for the people who are responsible for these actions. So those are a few things that I think can happen. And I think people need to be aware. One of the things I focused on in this hour that I did for Nat Geo is implicit bias. And so many people don't realize how we're so culturally conditioned.
So what would implicit bias be? What would be an
So
example?
that's basically just all the messages we get. Our brains are hardwired to make these associations. And 80% of women and 75% of men associate women with home and men with work still. Because from the time we come out of the womb, we're accosted by these images that condition us to see gender a certain way. And I'm on the advisory board of an organization called See Her, which is 80 companies that are committed to portraying girls and women differently in advertising. And I think advertising is incredibly powerful in shaping our concepts of gender roles and stereotypes. So I think we really need to take a very holistic approach. It's not just newsrooms, it's across industries. It's in the home, how you talk to kids. I remember Jay, my late husband, we saw a movie with Tony Danza, I think, and Ellie was with us, and she was like 3 or 4 at the time. And in the cab, Jay said, wow, Tony Danza throws like a girl. I said, never say that. You cannot say that. You have a daughter. Do not say those kinds of things. But we have to really just be aware of the messages we're sending to young women, little girls, and to little boys in terms of what our expectations are and what our limitations should not be.
So Shannon, tell us about Press Forward and what you think ought to happen to address this.
Yeah, well, we're really passionate about creating solutions. I mean, as you've said, we've had so many stories come out. They're going to continue to come out. But what do we do next? And I think it's a global problem, having just returned from overseas. This is a problem in terms of the objectification and the reduction of women, which results in all kinds of behaviors around the world. But what we're trying to do with Press Forward is we have 2 main goals. One is to do a blueprint study, a 6-month study in partnership with news organizations, to do culture assessments, to look at how are the processes working, how are the teams working, is there a culture here of verbal abuse or bullying, is there a culture here of objectification of women, how much diversity is there in that workplace in all respects, is this, and one thing that I've tried to encourage and I've spoken about before is in any industry, I think, or in any room, any society, if you can shift your focus from the star or from the most powerful person in that room to the most vulnerable person, whether it's a maid or it could be an intern or it could be an assistant, what is their experience like? Do they feel empowered? Do they have a voice? Do they feel safe? Is this a place where they can succeed? And so if you can shift your perspective as a manager, then that will probably change a lot of processes very naturally. So we want to do a study, partner with news organizations, and we also are already partnering with Pointer and other organizations to do in-depth training of assistants and interns, training of managers, training at all levels of organizations to prevent this from happening. And that training isn't just for men, but it's also for women, because I think part of the problem here is for women to know their limits and to be able to have a voice and feel really comfortable using it.
But have the news organization, Shannon, been receptive to some of the things that you all are trying to do? Because that's a real clue in terms of what progress you're going to make. I'm sorry that I asked.
Please go ahead.
Okay?
Yes.
Well, that's a good question. And I mean, it's a bit mixed. We have a partnership with the Wall Street Journal. In terms of the television networks, there's been one that the president of that network sounds very interested, but he hasn't committed to anything yet. And then the other networks, no answer yet. I don't want to say too much because we really do want to partner with them, but I think that hesitance is a sign of this resistance, and people's jobs are on the line, and you have these entrenched power structures that have to change throughout our society. So
Do you think it costs us? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Do you think it costs us credibility with readers and viewers to have these to have this situation with newsrooms where there is sexual harassment? Do you think does it matter to viewers and readers? Do you think, Rebecca?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that people expect us to work in as high a standard as possible, and when news organizations or any organization falls short of that, it's disappointing. And I think it's interesting. We're doing a women's conference in September, and I've talked to companies about coming and very high-level executives, and we're getting a tremendous response, which is the good news. But what's happening on the phone is fascinating because they're like, well, what if something happens? What if something breaks ahead of time and it shows that we're not perfect? You know what the news is? Nobody's perfect. Everybody has issues. We all need to talk about it. I would say that men, the thing I most worry about is alienating men. I would say that I had male bosses more than female bosses who promoted me on maternity leave, who sent me to China with 3 young kids. I was given a lot of chances. And I'm so worried now, in a sense, because a lot of men are coming up to me and saying, well, can I even go out for a drink with a woman? Can I have a meeting alone with a woman?
And what do you say?
I say, of course. Like when I was foreign editor of the Journal, whenever there was a bureau chief who came from a distant place, I would always have dinner with that person because we needed to break bread, we needed to understand one another. And I'm worried about what happens to women if we kind of go the other direction. I think we need to move forward. We need to try to admit that nobody is perfect here and to just work through it. The secret settlements also just have to go away.
Right, it's been pretty toxic. Do you think it matters? I'm sorry, Mona, go ahead.
Well, on the subject of where to draw the lines, right, and what will men take as the message, one of the things that I think we're missing is that men need to feel that they are not looked upon as would-be rapists or would-be sexual harassers. But at the same time, there has to be a certain realism about human nature. And one of the things that our society used to have a better handle on was that men are the more aggressive the more sexually aggressive of the two sexes. And they have to be brought up to be gentlemen. And there has to be that expectation. And sex is not a casual thing. So somehow men have gotten the message in the last few years, I think largely as a result of the sexual revolution, that it's like women are just like they are, and it's all good fun. And if I'm Mark Halperin and I walk up behind a woman who's sitting in my office and the door is closed and I rub my erect penis against her shoulder, which is one of the things that was reported, that she's going to think that's really hilarious, just like I do. And we have to be more realistic. We have to send the message, no, that's not okay, all right? Under no circumstances is it okay, and under no circumstances should a young woman who wants to have a meeting with Harvey Weinstein or anybody think that it's okay for him to invite her to a meeting in his hotel room.
I'm sorry, what normal guy thinks it's okay to rub his erect penis on someone? I'm sorry.
Hey, would you have ever dreamed that it was Mark Halperin who was doing things like that? Yeah. None of us would have.
Okay, we'll hear from you later. Adrienne, I want to ask you, do you think that there are an increasing number of women in positions of power in the news media and elsewhere, not as much boards we were talking about before we started, but Rebecca's an example, you're an example. My boss, almost all my bosses at USA Today are women now, the publisher, the editor, the managing editor to whom I report. Is that the solution? Does that make a difference, or do you think that is not sufficient? Does that not make such a difference?
I think it absolutely makes a difference. I don't think it's the end-all be-all. I think the way forward is to have, as Katie said, a holistic view of what better looks like, right? That means having an intersectional approach to what it means to support women in the workplace, right? That is creating a culture that, like when we talk about culture, creating a place where sexual harassment doesn't happen, right? But it's also a place where women are not the only ones in the room, right? Where I'm not sitting in a meeting and I'm the only one. Where women are able to not have to act and present themselves like men in order to rise to the occasion, right? For the standard of what it means to be excellent at your job, not be predicated on our understanding of men doing that job well. All of that goes into creating a culture, and all of that, and the focus on all of that is what makes us better, right? Sexual assault or sexual harassment and sexual assault in the worst cases don't happen in a vacuum, right? These are power structures that happen all over the world, in newsrooms and in businesses and in households and all over the place. And I think having language to be able to articulate that, and having managers all the way up and down the chain, right, from your intern to your CEO, be able to put words and language and be articulate about what harassment is and how it presents itself in this workplace in overt and covert ways, that's the way forward. And if we can't do that, I don't know that having a woman managing editor is sufficient.
I want to give you all a chance to ask the questions on your mind, and I would just ask that you wait for a microphone to come to you, and that you ask a question, not make a speech, although I'm sure you could make a wonderful speech. And you can either ask a question to the whole group, but if you want to direct a question to some particular panelist, please feel free to do that. And so, does anyone have a question? Okay, yes, please, go ahead. Wait for the microphone, if you would, please. Thanks. I was actually pointing at this woman here. Yes, thank you. But you could. That would. Oh, okay. Great, yeah.
Okay, hi, my name is Jazmin Tanner, and my question is two-part. So preceding the METOO movement was the Are You OK Sis movement. And so a lot of people don't really know about that because it was started by Black women. And so how do we make sure that marginalized people are not kind of, quieted, or we don't disregard their voices when they're kind of making the same statements, so that we can make sure this is an intersectional movement? And then the second question has to do with Terry Crews. I don't think it's necessarily just a woman and man thing, it's just consent and professionalism. So how do we make sure that we center the conversation around consent and professionalism instead of necessarily just a man-woman dichotomy?
All right, thanks for your question. We'll deal with it, and then we'll come back to you. Who would like to field this one?
Well, I just would like to say those were two excellent questions. I'll take the last one. I mean, I think that's totally true. I mean, we've seen incidents, obviously, in Hollywood and elsewhere where it's not necessarily a female thing, and I think that's a really important thing to point out, that it is about consent, it is about a level of professionalism. And I think one of the things is, this is now being taken seriously in workplaces. I think workplace reputation really matters, to your earlier point about millennials and younger people wanting to work at an organization that shares their values and won't put up with certain behaviors. So I think that just the fact that there's, I sense, Adrian, I don't know about you, but much more emphasis not only on gender equality, but much more on representation, not just diversity, but inclusion. And I think many more companies are much more mindful of that. Is that your impression for the other panelists here? And Adrian, is that what you're seeing?
I would say so. I think if I could also take a stab at both of those questions, I think to answer your first question, I think it is about having everyone center the voices of marginalized people, not just marginalized people, right? Is when we talk about METOO, we talk about Tarana Burke, right? We don't just talk about Selma Hayek and Uma Thurman and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And to have that be a responsibility of everyone. I think to Katie's point about your second question, it is about conduct, right? To not, and this goes kind of to your point about overcorrecting, right? That it's not necessarily looking at women or sexual harassment as a women's problem, right? That we're not engaging with women as though sexual harassment is their cross to bear and their problem to deal with. But to say that this is about accountability and professionalism and the ability to conduct yourself in a proper manner, and that doesn't have a gender. That's not a gender thing to know how to keep it together in the workplace. So.
Very true. Let's go to the, yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you. One of the things that I'm struggling with is the conversation is still centered around sexual harassment training, which actually the New York Times ran an article not too long ago saying how sexual harassment training actually doesn't work because it centers the burden of prevention still on the victims because they have to be the ones to speak up about it, but rather looking at a different alternate way of actually addressing sexual harassment through bystander training that then trains people to speak up when they witness these incidences. And I'm wondering if you all have witnessed that yourselves in the spaces that you are in, and I'm wondering if you're seeing that change the conversation when that shift is being made.
No, that's interesting.
Oh, I hate this bystander stuff. I really do. It's the same thing you hear about when this is how we should solve the problem of rape, is that bystanders should speak up. Look, it's just not realistic. Most rapes happen behind closed doors. There's no opportunity for a bystander to intervene. No, it absolutely has to be that women have come to a point where they're saying, this behavior is unacceptable, we will always speak up about it, and they will be respected, and that men will understand what the rules are and that they have to behave in a certain way. because it has to be a matter of socialization. You just can't have outsiders in all the right places to spy the men who are misbehaving. They wouldn't have been there in the Harvey Weinstein case. They wouldn't have been there for the other cases that we're discussing. Sorry, did I miss the point?
I'm going to respond to that only because in the Harvey Weinstein case, there was people who were driving these women to the hotel room.
Well, yeah, but here's the problem. Okay, so a few of these people who have been identified as having been harassers, some of us knew about or heard about before, right? So you've heard rumors about somebody, and then people say, well, you are part of the problem because you didn't speak up. But wait a second. You hear rumors about people all the time. Do we want a system or a society where we start repeating baseless rumors about people and possibly ruining their reputations and their careers based on hearsay? That's also a problem.
What about the point about sexual harassment continuing to put the onus on the victim? Is that true, and is there an alternative way to deal with this that would be effective?
Well, I'd like to just contribute one thing which addresses both your question and what you just commented on. I do think that this has to do with a culture problem within a company, but also more broadly in society. And I do think it helps if you are a manager and you see another manager mistreating or verbally bullying a colleague or a younger person to say, hey, stop that, or pull that person aside and say, this isn't acceptable. This is not the way things are done at ABC News or whatever news organization you're at. I think that can be really powerful because this behavior evolves in a system.
If it's seen, I mean, if someone is there to see it, yeah.
No, but I would take the point, look, many of us are in meetings, right? And I learned a long time ago that I try to really speak up early in a meeting, even if I just force myself, even if my thought is not perfectly formed, because otherwise it just gets to be a lot of men talking and you don't feel like you're part of the conversation and you feel worse and worse. And I think one of the best things that anyone can do when someone speaks up at a meeting is say, that was a great point, and to have their back and to actually support them. And we have to figure out a way forward, and that's where men are really important as well, because they sometimes just don't even realize it. They just don't realize how they make other people feel.
I think that's an excellent point, because I think there are small things and behavioral changes that can happen. You know, there's an expression for when you say something at a meeting, and everyone's like, yeah, whatever. And then three people later, the guy makes the same point, and they're like, that is so brilliant. And it's called keep-eating. And so I think even being aware of things like that, being aware that when there's a birthday party, the women aren't the first people to say, I'm going to go buy the cupcakes, or I'm going to bring the paper plates out. It's called office housework, you know. And another thing is, I noticed at a board meeting I was at, the men just say their point. The women kind of say, I don't know if this makes sense, or this may not be germane to our conversation, this tendency to apologize. So I think there are also little signals that we sometimes send that I think sabotage ourselves. And Valerie Jarrett had a rule at the White House that if that happened, all the women in the meeting would point it out. And suddenly the men were much more aware of it. So I think there are small steps that can make big difference.
And I just want to go back to your point about bystanders. I think what I heard you trying to say was actually talking about systems of support. And I think that there's a multifaceted way that you can go about that, right? It might not necessarily be structured bystander training like one would do managerial diversity training, right? But it can be a yes and, or a that was a great point in a meeting. It can be talking to another manager when you see them berating a fellow employee. It can be having structured programs with your HR so that they know how to deal with issues when people do feel the need to go forward. It is creating a culture in which people feel comfortable coming forward in the first place. There's not one single way to do that, and I think that doing all of those things in tandem is the way that people feel supported, which I think is what you were getting at with bystanders.
And I think bystander training can be incredibly effective in situations where there's a likelihood of sexual assault, and that can be an incredibly powerful deterrent if there's a situation where somebody is inebriated and is obviously may be in trouble, and somebody steps in and says, let's go. So I think there are different kinds of bystander training and different kinds of interactions that we should just point out.
And different expectations about behavior, about what you would do if you saw somebody, a woman who was clearly drunk and a man was leading her out of a bar, what your obligation is, whether you know her or not. Let's take a question over here.
My question is whether or not there really is a sea change, and given the fact that it's 45 years since Ms. Magazine and the feminist movement started, and then we had a backtrack on the feminist movement, is this really a sea change? Is it going to last?
I think that's such a great, that was actually going to be my closing question, so thanks a lot. And that is this in fact a transformational moment, or is this one of those things where, oh, great, we all care about sexual harassment, and then we care about something else? Is it, Mona, you look very skeptical, I gotta say.
I hope that it is a sign of something, but then I may have a slightly different point of view on this from others. What I hope it is a backlash against the sexual revolution itself. I hope that it's an opportunity for that young women are saying, you know what? I'll quote a feminist, Jessica Valenti, who you remember when that Aziz Ansari story broke in Babe magazine online and caused a lot of controversy. In any event, what Jessica Valenti said about that story was, she said, look, a lot of men are going to read about that date and they're going to say, this is a totally normal sexual interaction. And she said, and what they don't realize is this isn't working for us, meaning for women. And you know, as much could be said, I don't usually agree with Jessica Valenti, but I thought that was a very astute observation. A lot of this isn't working for women. And it's not what they want, and it's not what they need. People need love and tenderness and commitment and fidelity, all those old-fashioned virtues. And one of the things that the METOO movement could be is an effort to reestablish certain standards about what it means to behave like an honorable human being, whether you're a man or a woman, but especially if you're a man, because they are the ones who are, let's face it, we're not sitting here talking about all the women who are sexually harassing their young male assistants. We're just not talking about that because it doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen because there are differences between the sexes. And so that's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that this will be a backlash against the sexual revolution, that we'll have a revival of good manners and good behavior on the part of men and women.
I want to answer that question.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Differently. I would say I'm hopeful that it's going to last. I don't know that it lasting, I'm not sure is going to present itself in ways of new workplace policies or the eradication of sexual harassment. But I do think that what we've gained from all of these discussions is language that articulates the rage that women have been feeling all of this time and bottled, right? And that has been released into the atmosphere, and people are able to have productive conversations person to person that I think change the way that we conceive of consent and what a positive sexual interaction is supposed to be like, and whether that retreats to old-fashioned sexual mores or not. I think that we are going to have conversations that means in person-to-person interactions, women are able to reach an agreement with their partners to what is acceptable to them in the small scale, and that's still important.
You can talk about Me Too in a big way or a small way, and I'd like to focus on the sexual harassment in the workplace part of that and ask, is this a sea change? And maybe just let the other three members of the panel weigh in. Rebecca, what do you think?
I think that it remains to be seen, but I'm hopeful. I think that it won't be the case any longer that women feel as alone as they did. And I have to say that among women I talk to, almost 100% have had something happen to them along the way. I think it's also true that our eyes have been opened to the cost of the power imbalance. And you hear time and time again, if there's one woman, things can kind of continue as it has been, but if there's two or three, it doesn't happen. Right. And so I am a bit fearful that younger women look at all this and put their hands up and say, oh my God, I can't do it. I've got the kids, the family balance, the sexual harassment, I'm just gonna give up. And I hope that doesn't happen, because the women, women are now graduating at every level of undergraduate, graduate, masters, like whatever way you want to measure it, they are surpassing the men in aptitude, and they get into the workforce and it just falls off consistently to the point where CEO women now, we're going backwards. We're going backwards here. And that's got to be a concern for all of us. So I think it's a very important question, and all of us need to resolve to just try to keep moving it forward and not be too discouraged and realize that you aren't alone.
Shannon, sea change?
It seems to me like a seminal moment. It seems like what you said, an unleashing of a lot of emotions and experiences that have been there for a long time. And I think the challenge for all of us is now the solutions. And it's not an easy road. And perhaps this will die off and we won't make any real change. Because I do think it's on a societal level as well. It's wrapped up in our expectations of women, especially in television, our visual objectification of women and the way you have to look when you're a news anchor on a cable news network. All of these things are tied together. And I think I still think, as I get older, I realize there's this sort of base level of misogyny, sometimes towards women about anything, age, sexuality, what you have it. So all of that has to change. And I listened to an interview actually with Jane Fonda a few weeks ago, and she said, if women were paid the same amount as men and they had the same seniority, this simply wouldn't happen. And I think that's a really good point. It wouldn't happen if they were at the same level. So.
Katie, sea change?
Well, I'm very optimistic. I really am. I think it's critically important that we continue to have these conversations, that we include men in these conversations, and that we don't demonize all men as a result of this conversation. And to Shannon's point, I totally agree. I think as more women climb the ladders and as they have more power, the likelihood of this kind of behavior, I think, decreases significantly. And there are some clear-cut things that can be done. For example, there's something called the Rooney Rule, which was named for the owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers, I believe, that said when there was an opening in a coaching or managerial position, at least one minority or female candidate, I think it was one minority candidate, because this was in the NFL, had to be interviewed. And I interviewed some women in Silicon Valley, and they said, if we don't know about these candidates, we can't hire them. And they implemented the Rooney Rule, and the number of women and minorities that were hired in her Silicon Valley firm increased to 75%. So I think a lot of it are some really pragmatic steps that can be taken. Things like blind resumes can be very useful. A commitment on the part of people like Mark Benioff at Salesforce to have gender equality and also pay equity is incredibly important as well. So I think some of these are the foundational steps that we need to achieve in order to also address these other problems as well, that they'll start to dissipate as the power imbalance is corrected. So I feel super positive, because I'm so bummed out about so many other things that if I get bummed out about this and I'm not hopeful, I'm just going to crawl in a hole and never come out.
So don't do that. I would say I am incredibly optimistic for three reasons. Women are speaking up. That is not going to change. And if older women are speaking up, but younger women don't think there's a question about whether you speak up. Number two, people are believing women when they speak up. And number three, there are more women in charge. And I think that makes a huge difference. So I am a complete optimist, at least about this. All right. So we're out of time. Thank you all.